So that too, and if you notice that when she answers a particular question, like there's an affect that is notable, you could just like put in parentheses, excited.
It's gonna be so fascinating. Just as a complete side note, I'm currently getting certified in somatic coaching, and there's so much that both I find in the sort of democracy space, but just as you're talking about with the Quaker, it's cool to like see those things.
Well, I have a reflection on that, if it's okay. So people give me the feedback that the first time they hear this, that children should be allowed to vote, that I think this, they have like, it's like a gut punch. They're like, what do you mean? It's like a visceral reaction to something strange. But I'll tell you time and time again, I have talked to many different types of people, and if someone is curious enough to stay in a conversation with me, they learn a lot. And sometimes we go from 0 to 60, you know? And again, even within the course of a single conversation, they can go from never having heard of this before to, I would say, a place of really like questioning the status quo deeply and thinking that there's a lot more to learn about it.
So I'm going to invite us all into just a time of whatever is comfortable for you. Maybe you want to close your eyes, maybe you want to softly focus on the floor, but just a time of quiet and listening. And see if you can stretch your ears to listen beyond the walls of this building, beyond the trains that are going by, out to the Mystic River that flows through Medford, into the Boston Harbor. Can you hear seagulls? And then bring the focus of your listening back in to this room and to the sound of your own breath. And then if you were really listening, could you hear your blood rushing in your arteries and veins? Maybe the sound of your heart. The movement of your emotions and your fancies. And from that deep listening space, I'm going to invite us all to hold Jean Marie and to try to listen with that same level of intensity as she describes for us what is coming up for her as she thinks about this issue and where the dilemma points might be.
Okay. So I'm a philosopher, my background, and so there was a part of me that like loves to disrupt status quo, to like think about things in really abstract ways and sort of kind of push my own comfort level. So this is really welcome, and I will also acknowledge like also very uncomfortable, which is, you know, kind of where we should all strive to exist. I am struggling with the idea, and I want to sort of parse out where the struggle is for me. So the struggle I have is sort of 14 and younger, how we are thinking about young people in their own developmental, in their own development, both emotionally, you know, cognitively, and thinking about what it would mean to give them agency, which I think is very powerful and could have very positive benefits. And also recognizing that what we oftentimes, and I'm thinking very much back to I'm gonna correct myself as I say this, but that when we are oftentimes voting on things that are policy related, that are kind of higher level structural related, that they're all incredibly nuanced and complicated. And I think about, I've done work with adolescents in creating policy recommendations, and at a high school level, how complicated it is to talk about, it's great to talk about a proposal to bring to the state legislature. Oftentimes trying to conceptualize budget for that can be a big barrier of like, okay, this is an amazing idea, but in practical terms, what would it look like to actually like fund this, right? And how complicated that gets. It's not impossible, but that definitely, in thinking about the empowering, like I said, I have 2 8-year-olds and a 6-year-old. I love them dearly. I'm very pro-democratic, and there are points in time where I wouldn't let them give voice to what we're having for dinner because we would struggle as coming to a democratic decision. I also, on a second point, understand the idea of, I think, Robin, what you were talking about is sort of because young people are not counted in policy decisions, how often we see them being the underserved. So you look at early childhood education, you look at paid family leave, you look at all of these issues that do not have the mandates that they really require for not only young people to thrive, but for parents of young people to be able to survive. Mm-hmm. And so I'm very interested in the power rebalancing of, if you have young children in your house, you are a proxy for their voice, as being a really powerful reason for thinking about this concept.
I have an open-ended question.
Yes.
Okay, I offer you the word belonging, and I wonder what holding that word with your sense of this, does it, so, and I wish I had a picture to show you right now, but a peer of my daughter's in third grade. Third grade in Massachusetts is when the social studies frameworks have them learn about local government. Mm-hmm. And so there was a fellow mom who knows that I'm interested in this issue, sent me a photo of her daughter's worksheet. She brought it home, and it was the end of the unit, and it has a what's one thing you learned, and the girl wrote, there are 9 people on Cambridge City Council. She drew a picture of the people on the city council. And then what's one question you still have? And her question was, why can't kids vote? So she's a third grader. That means she was like 8 or 9. So just the sort of age group you're talking about. And the picture that she drew was of the polling place that happens in our school gymnasium. Mm-hmm. And the sign that points to the door, it says to vote. She drew that to vote sign. She drew a stick figure, and the stick figure was crying. Mm-hmm. And so what I interpret from that is, like, I spoke earlier about how the Declaration of Independence.
I'm gonna cut you off.
Oh, sorry.
Because what you're saying is not important.
Yeah, but it's not centering her experience.
The open-endedness of it.
Okay. Yeah, belonging.
Yeah.
Yeah. So voters is status.
Yeah. I think it's a powerful concept, and I do see, like, my one of my 8-year-olds just finishing unit on the ADA, and the impact of her learning about people struggling to gain rights was something that profoundly affected her. And so, it's I think that there is certainly argument for young people being able to perceive of in-groups versus out-groups. I mean, that's certainly, and the idea of belonging as a conception. I believe in the building civic muscle is something that I also feel very strongly about. And so the concept, and again, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your name, but of having participating in something, like asking 18-year-olds to suddenly participate in something that maybe they have very little education and potentially even very little interest in, because why would they have interest in something that felt inaccessible?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that
Yeah.
I love the idea of calling in young people into civic participation. I think that makes a lot of sense. I still struggle with the idea, and this is why I think I asked the nuanced question before, which is voting for what,
Mm-hmm.
and in what capacity. Because I do see a ton of value in getting, again, I'm going sort of in two directions. Like I have a hard time, I bring my kids to vote with me.
Mm-hmm.
Every time we have great fortune of same thing being voting being in person, having it be a very community oriented piece, and getting a chance to have them come and sort of talk through what the ballot measures and things like that.
Yeah.
I think that for them, watching me exercise my ability to vote is very important, and be a community participant and bringing them along. Again, I would see I see sort of like representative value much more in like me having a voice, having sort of multiplying my voice because I have young people in my house, and less about the agency for them to be the voter. I don't know if that's.
So I want to. Okay.
Oh.
So I think you mentioned earlier that you think that kids should be able to vote in local and school elections. So I want to hear a little bit more about that. Why do you think that kids should have the ability to participate in those processes?
It's a great question, and it's one that I think I need to ponder myself. And part of it, like I love the school board, some of the Vote 16 work that's happening where younger people are being able to vote. In school board elections and local elections. Part of that for me is the direct impact that young people, and I don't know if anyone knows of Kentucky Student Voice, which is a very phenomenal youth-led organization that I've worked with in the past, and this idea from the disability rights, like nothing about us without us, is
Yes.
I think a very profound statement. And so I'm a proponent of having young people represented on school boards, not just as a voting participant, and not just as the sort of token young person who's sitting on a who's smiling in the corner, which is oftentimes what happens. And I think it forces adults to take seriously the fact that their decisions are impacting directly the day-to-day life of young individuals. Yeah.
I have an open-ended question.
Yeah.
So you talked about why it's important to you. When you think about the enfranchisement of young people, what are the voices of fear that you hear?
The hesitation for me, I take my 6-year-old, for example, like we talk because of who I am and how our house runs, and we talk a lot about politics, we talk a lot about policy, that our kids are interested in what's happening in our community, they're interested in, they go to an incredibly racially and socioeconomically diverse school, and so there's a lot of they have a lot of exterior exposure to issues that are important to them. Like my 6-year-old doesn't yet have, like I see his view of the world as being still in that developmental phase where it's like, if it's not in front of him, if it's not, that conceptually he has a harder time understanding how a decision here would be impacted in another place, for example. which is why I come back to the idea of like the local, I think in those younger ages is like, you know, if we're voting on a budget, I think to be able to say, look, this budget created this crosswalk, which is a safer crosswalk. Yes.
In Paris, France, participatory budgeting
Yes.
allows any age ballot access.
Yeah.
If you lived in Paris with the children that you have in the ages that they are, would you feel that it was unsafe for them to access one of those PB ballots?
No, because I mean, based on what I know about participatory budgeting, the education component, the sort of engagement component for me in, you know, in that, and again, this is why I think intergenerational spaces are so critical, is that there's sort of this co-learning process in participatory budgeting that I don't see in school board, and I don't see in elections. I mean, you know, I'm deeply engaged in civic education for the purpose that like we are failing our young people in not being able to be provided with that, you know, with the capacity to even understand how the role of government, I mean, it's tragic, right? So if that exists, you know, if the sort of co-learning component was a part of how we vote, I think my framework would change a little bit, but yeah.
If ballots didn't have a write-in blank, would you feel that it was safer? Because presumably only the candidates that reach a threshold of support from a party or from donors or from, you know, it's not every person that gets on the ballot.
Right.
Any person can be a write-in, and in fact, you can write it like in the UK, Lord Buckethead gets a considerable number of votes every year because that's the protest party. And you can also get a ballot and return it blank. So do you think if there was proactive instruction that a person who hasn't yet developed an opinion could vote blank, would that feel safer? But also a reminder that whether or not you vote, your voter propensity is public record and does change the behavior of, is less of an open-ended question.
Yeah, I'm gonna let you give one more answer, and then I'm gonna move us to the rest of the process so we can get, because I sense that there's a lot of discussion possibilities.
We're being very heady, aren't we?
I know.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's me. So I think I understand the question, and again, I think that there's a tension for me around loving and believing in democratic processes as they exist, and the desire, and we've seen it through voting, to sort of upend the status quo writ large, right? That there's, and having sympathy for that as well. You know, in my, I guess sort of my parting question in this, and again, sort of thinking about the proxy voting, is, you know, in my house, to be totally frank, like Kamala Harris would have received 5 votes. My kids hate Trump because of where they live and the environment that they are in. But I don't know if I feel like that because of, I don't know that their hatred of Trump and their love for Kamala Harris is well reasoned. It just is. And again, I think going back to the presentation, like you could say that about a whole bunch of adults in whatever direction, right? And so it's like I'm arguing against myself as I'm creating.
And it sounds like you're someone who's done a fair amount of political socialization, and some people might say children should not be politically socialized because then they will develop biases that we would rather they don't have.
Right. Yeah, which I think is also a great idea, except we live in a highly politicized world, and even if they weren't getting it from us, they would be getting it from other places. And so it's like, I think we also have to acknowledge the reality of kind of the framework that we live in now, which is like it comes from everywhere, which is, again, I think an argument for young people. I think we don't give young people enough credit for the fact that they live in a highly sophisticated world and intake highly sophisticated concepts, you know, especially at 14 and above, which is, again, where, and, you know, I just argued that my child understands the ADA probably better than I ever have. So there's, you know, there's that, but I do see that in my experience in sort of the work that I've done developmentally, seeing that sophistication as a beautiful.
Christina, there was one other thing that she had said initially, which was to give children agency. And that construction was jarring for me, because if there's a notion that there's human will, like even infants are responding to the sensory environment, and my philosophy of parenting is that I'm playing a role of maybe directing their attention, bringing the resources toward them, pushing away things that are dangerous, but I am not giving them agency. I am acknowledging the existence that already is there of their agency and helping to amplify the things that fit with our society and pay less attention to the things that are antisocial.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think in giving maybe isn't the right word, I guess what I'm saying is acknowledging the human agency and providing, empowering that human agency that exists. Like, it's not, if that's sort of like clarifying.
So again, arguably counting it. Your vote is your voice.
I want to, at this point, what we would do is center sort of back into silence and then come to a place where people can make observations about some of your answers. And what I want to do is ask if someone has an I was going to go around, but I want to think about time. If someone like has an observation that they want to make, to share that, and then what I might do is just close us out. Oh, you were paying the best attention.
I was also thinking about this agency question, so I'm glad you brought that up at the end there. And I like your response there about empowering the human agency that exists, because I think so often in households where the agency isn't lifted up, right, when people don't recognize that or aren't encouraging that within children. Speaking as somebody who was a teacher for a long time, a lot of students don't recognize that agency until so much later, 14 plus, right? I taught 17 and 18-year-olds for most of my career. And there's this thing that happens that I love, oftentimes with juniors in high school, that like, that's like the agency moment, like recognizing that, if they haven't, had that before, like all of a sudden recognizing like, oh, I'm going to be out on my own, like out of my parents' house soon, like what am I asking questions about? How am I engaging in the world? And it reminds me of a session that I went to earlier that talked about the importance of agency that happens in question asking and the metacognitive work of like interrogating the questions that we are asking. All of this requires a lot of critical thinking skills that are at risk right now in our schools, and being discouraged in our schools so much. And so I'm just sort of like ruminating with, and I love, Charlotte, what you were saying earlier about how, like this, if you are engaged from the beginning, then you can keep doing it, because I've seen so often like civic education not happening until later in high school, and then it's like, what? I wasn't paying attention to this. I don't care about this, right? My niece, who just finished her freshman year of high school, just had her first civics class, and I would like ask her about all of these things. And we have devalued civics so much as a society that there's so much of this, like we've devalued critical thinking, we've devalued civics education. And so I'd love to think of what would happen if we put the value back in those spaces, if we like really helped students think through what does it mean to question, what does it mean to have this agency. I am just incredibly skeptical of our current system to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one thing that I wanna notice that you said that, I think was, it was structured as an if. You said if co-education and a co-learning process was put in place. And what I hear that sort of evolves from, that observation is if the system was restructured so that people really knew the impact that their vote made and understood what participatory democracy entailed, and the pathways for participation in democracy were very different. I think about, there's a, Abigail Ortiz works at the Southern Jamaica Plain Health Center, and she talks about how you have to change the whole way that the healthcare system is structured so that it works for single moms who have to work all day and can only come at nights and weekends for their appointments, and who don't have to rehash the entire thing every time they see a different provider. And if we did that, the whole system would work better for everyone. And so one of the things I hear you saying, like, embedded in that is if we restructured the system of franchise and voter education for young voters, it would actually work a lot better for checked out voters.
Absolutely, yeah, that definitely makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I think that I really like, you know, for those people who can sit in discomfort, I really like the idea of this pushing the restructuring conversation, because I do think that there's opportunity to rethink about the way that we engage people in voting, and not just voting. I mean, I think that if we're going to talk about kids not being able to vote, there should be further conversation about how we engage young people in community in general, and in civic spaces in general, and how devalued their their existences in many of those spaces. To be totally honest, I think there is a deeper conversation about sort of the restructuring of the way we think about democracy itself, which is, again, coming from you have to recognize that democracy started with only white male landowning individuals as being the people who were valued in those spaces. So
what if we hold the parallel? So I have this bag over there, it says born to read, and I added and to vote. And some people think that allowing reading is very dangerous because the ideas you can come across in books, some of them are unorthodox and so on. And it's true, sometimes a ballot will have a candidate that, if that were the leader, then that's not good. But there is this notion of early literacy, and the website for Massachusetts Civic Learning Coalition is MA Civics for All. It's not for students, it's not for adults, it's not for voters, it's for all. And what about the perspective of the person who is disenfranchised? We've taken the perspective of, can we give permission to those people? But what if you're the person who wants to get permission to be included, and you're saying, listen to me, knock, 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 let me in. What, that, is it a legitimate election if there were many people who didn't get to be part of it from the outset? So can we be worried about the legitimacy of the election being proportionate to the number of people who were eligible to have a say, the number of stakeholders who were eligible? And if we're only saying the scope is schools, that children exist beyond schools. So shouldn't the scope be their stakeholderhood?
Yeah.
I mean, if you have a long enough time horizon, I understand that maybe if you're saying, okay, well, the funding for this particular campaign, so I try to give some grace to Vote 16 campaigners because they help to break people from the status quo, but I also use the critical analysis lens of childism, which is sometimes compared with feminism, but other times compared with sexism. So in what ways is childhood status a constraint that has some of the trappings that had trapped women and continue to trap children? in terms of you were talking about older high schoolers, preschool is a really wonderful age to think about children's suffrage, because preschoolers play alongside one another, conflicts will happen, and when we disagree, what's the process? First, we hear everyone. We don't just hear a powerful person, we make sure that we hear everyone. Then we decide together, and then we follow through. Like, that's a 3-step process. But if there were any people who were not heard, then their sense of belonging and justice, and holistically the experience of diversity and inclusion. And so what does the design of the system for equity look like? So that maybe a person who's developing their language skills around how to be patient and listen to another perspective, how to identify the feelings that you're feeling and name them, how to know that you might not get closure right away, but we're gonna have another chance tomorrow to play again and try again and practice again. And the muscle building.
Christine, you made the point in your session earlier when you were talking about the skills of dialogue and the early childhood teacher said all of these skills of dialogue are what we do in an early childhood classroom.
Yeah, we use this guidelines for dialogue in the work that I do, and it's, dialogue on one side of the page and debate on the other side of the page, right? And we learn the skills of debate in the classroom, right? But so often I have this preschool teacher, pre-K teacher say to me, these are the things that the dialogue things are the things that my students are doing naturally, right? Except for honoring silence. But you know what? But adults aren't great at that either. So, right? And so how are we thinking about like re-engaging with those natural things for young people, and really like lifting those up instead of seeing them as things that we have to like explain away in our education system by creating, everybody wants to debate each other all the time and everybody wants to win the debate. I'm by nature not a competitive person, and so like debate was always very difficult for me in a classroom, because I'd be like, oh, that was a really great point, like I really appreciate what you just said. And I think that that's what we have to do more, like celebrate the points that people are making, the questions that people are bringing to it. But it goes back to, there's a lot of overhaul needed in education spaces.
Education, I think voter engagement, voter education,
Yes.
it's an overwhelming system, and I wonder, again, I'd like to be, Charlotte, I absolutely appreciated all the points you made, and I think they are very, very valid points. I think that you brought up a lot of great thought. I'm not walking out of here as a convert yet, but it reminds me that the idea of small d democracy or deliberative democracy, if we're thinking about how we institutionalize that and really lift up those kinds of practices. So it's like, how are we teaching democracy in a classroom? How are we teaching democracy in student government should not be deciding what colors are the prom colors for, they should be actually engaged in the democratic practices of their schools. And so I can see this sort of not death by 1,000 paper cuts, but whatever the much nicer sounding version is if we're infiltrating all of these democratic practices and principles, and does that evolve into a system where young people are provided with their inherent dignity and agency to be able to be much more active participants in the decisions that are being made for them, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So one thing I was struck by is sort of the conflict that you're having in terms of your children being able to, in particular your 6-year-old, being able to understand the impacts of decisions in other places, having almost like an object permanence sort of developmental thing, right?
Yeah.
Right? Is that you get what's happening in front of you, but it's hard to apply that to other people at another location or anything like that. And so, the examples that we were talking about with local elections or things that have a direct impact on them. But to me, it's almost the opposite, in that it seems to me when you're talking about concrete levels of budgeting or the cost of concrete and making those types of choices, those actually are some fairly I don't know, sophisticated math-related things that they haven't necessarily learned yet, right? But when we're in a representative democracy, and some of the larger, elections or things, to me, it almost, one thing I struggle with is it seems to make more sense to me that they would have the skills to assess a candidate. They're making judgment calls about people and who to trust, and who, has the, who's trustworthy, who seems honest, who seems to be invested in them and their future. In many ways, I think kids are really good judges of character, right? And if we're living in a representative democracy where we're choosing the people that we think will align with our interests and represent our interests well, then in some instances, I think like kids might be a better judge of character than a lot of adults are, right? And that is the way our system is set up. We're not sending kids or anyone to Congress to actually write the laws, right? Like when we give them the ability to, like a voter registration card, right? We're giving them the power to trust others in the process, and to reflect their interests. And so I see a little bit of a disconnect in the, what trust you would bestow upon a child in that process, if it's like in their school versus somewhere else, when we all really are putting our trust in someone else and making a judgment call as to their character and their honesty and their alignment with our interests.
That's
right?
a great point, and I do take that to heart, because I do think I think you're right, like kids bullshit meter, sorry, is like pretty spot on, right? And that the idea, so I guess I will nuance myself further into like, I think it's a cool idea for me to actually, and one of the programs that I have worked on in the past is actually trying to get electeds or folks who are campaigning to come and talk to young people, particularly, they're young people who are really interested in politics and interested in what's happening. Hard to do because they're not voting, which again, beautiful.
Yes, the incentive to come and be in the room with them.
Yeah.
And is there sometimes a mock election? Because I've written here kids can't vote, but often they can vote in an election that mocks them.
Yeah.
And Scholastic has been doing this since the 1950s, and only 2 times have the results differed from the broader population. And so it's really just that we are depriving this 1/5 of our population in Massachusetts, 1/4 of the population nationally, almost 1/3 in Utah, of the dignity of having their voices counted. But you said that you bring your children to the polling place. Do you live in Massachusetts?
I live in Maine.
Okay. Well, in Massachusetts, it's not a crime for a child to be the one who does the marking of the ballot. So an adult who wants to give a child the experience of being the voting decision maker can do that. Like, it's not against the law, so long as the adult is there being the one acquiring the ballot and being the one giving the ballot back. And I think it could be meaningful. So in the Children's Voting Colloquium, some adults decided that they would give their ballot to a child. And this was a Guardian UK newspaper article. And so it's really about counting, but elections are all about tabulation. So again, the S.508 H.814, it's a ballot access bill.
I have a question, because I take the point of representation very well, and I think that's a great argument. We in Maine have ballot initiatives. Well, we have ranked choice, which is a whole other, not that that impacts my thought about this at all, but we have ranked choice voting, which is awesome.
Well, it more likely leads to positive campaigning. So some people don't want children to be part of campaign spaces because they can feel very negative, lots of blaming, name calling. But if you have a ranked choice voting system where you have more positive campaigning, potentially a better environment.
I guess the ballot initiatives component for us is the one that and again, I'm gonna acknowledge the fact that a lot of 18+ year olds don't have any sense of what they're voting on, and they just go based on the commercials that
League of
are
Women Voters of
everywhere.
Maine is excellent, and they really try to demystify what's on ballots
Yeah,
and do voter forums for
yeah,
candidates.
totally. I mean, there's a lot that's done that's really positive, but that is a different kind of complicated initiative. Would I
As-
trust my 8-year-old to vote on a ballot initiative more than some of my neighbors? Yeah, probably, but that's
Mackenzie, will you talk again, because you have 3 children, and there was some time when you first heard about this idea. Did you hear about it from Charlotte? And do you feel that you would allow each of your children to get their own ballots? Like, how would it play out in your family, you know?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I learned about it through Charlotte.
Charlotte, did you have a period where you felt awkward talking to your mom about it? Like, I would felt
No.
awkward talking to my dad?
No, I feel like I can always talk to my mom about things, which,
Aw.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, look, I don't know that I would necessarily agree with all of the votes that my kids do, but that, I think, is kind of the point, right? I mean, they all came into the world with their own sort of views, and they navigate the world very differently
From each other.
from each other, very much so. But I think I'm on board with the idea of that, that's okay, and if we believe in democracy, then they should also have a way to use their voices and to be heard and to be listened to and for that to matter. And I also, I like the point that Charlotte made about, when you look at representation and, like, for example, the number of legislators from a different district, you count the children in that, right? And it seemed profoundly unfair that, because I have 3 children, our community has more representation, but we're not actually letting them have any say in how that representation is used.
Right, so the
That seems unfair.
disenfranchisement isn't just individual, it's also at the household level, at the neighborhood level, at the community level, the town level. Not every town has the same birth contribution as every other town.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
There were a couple of educators in the room. There's that educator concept of I do, we do, you do. Could that make it feel more comfortable for ballot access? Like, I do it for you when you're born, we do when you're in a period of learning, and then you do, I don't have to go with you anymore because now you feel pretty independent in this process. So you're like fully dependent in a period of greater interdependence, and even actually during that period of dependence, like before you became a mother, you didn't have to adjust your day-to-day to accommodate the ways that you were caring for another human. So
I should be able to represent my baby as a unit of.
So like a dyad of you plus baby having 2 ballots, and the younger the baby is, like the closer to the nursing stage, the more your needs for policy making have alignment, because you need to be able to be in the same time and place to do that transfer of nourishment.
Right. Yeah. It's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, thanks for the process, everybody.
Thank you all for listening to me like outwardly battle.
That was really helpful.
No, yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Well, and John Wall is a philosopher.
Oh, is he really?
Yeah.
Good to see you. You too.